everyone. In this topic analysis, we'll be going over the policy affirmative and negative positions for September, October. And so the first thing we probably want to do is give a little bit of background on the topic, right? And so the topic here is, in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory. And there are actually already a few countries with compulsory voting. The one that I think is probably most similar to the United States in terms of economic development, kind of democratic norms, etc., is probably Australia, which makes for a good case study to look at the effects of mandatory voting. They've actually had it for almost 100 years now. And then, there are a few other countries that the graph indicates. It's possible, right? A lot of people usually promote compulsory voting in a world where very few people vote, right? There's not really this movement in India where democratic participation is particularly high. Also in countries that are typically more democratic, right? No one hears Putin calling for compulsory voting. Sometimes, right, the LD topic is obviously phrased to be a philosophical question about the way that democracy and kind of agonism and deliberation work, right, in a form of government, which is good, right? That's kind of the point of LD. The problem, though, right here is that my job, at least, is to talk more about policy interpretations. And so we're going to temporarily sidestep the question of what a democracy is or what a democracy should be and evaluate this question through a purely utilitarian lens. So there are, specific countries have a lot of different mechanisms for voting, right? And many countries are pseudo-democratic. And so what this means, right, is we brought up the idea of Russia, but this also applies to countries like the United States and Canada. As far as I know, there are 0 countries which adhere to the Platonic Athenian ideal of democracy, where everyone gets to vote regardless of their vote on every policy. There's no such thing as representatives. And so there's an obvious topicality question of kind of what democracy is, right? And the answer to that is essentially, any type of voting system, because pure democracy is impossible. And I think that sets up an important topicality question later. And so you want to contour kind of advantages, right, specifically to the type of democratic legal system that we're talking about. It doesn't make sense to have, everyone vote in state elections in a country where there's only one government, right? It wouldn't make sense to have, say, Israel implement statewide level elections. And so it's important to kind of research the underlying kind of balance of federalism in countries, etc., and how kind of their balance with the federal government and the constitution of that country regulate voting so that you know your actor. The question that we want to ask ourselves, though, right, is that there's a highly non-trivial concentration of democracies. And the thing that we're going to be kind of exploring in this debate is what is the most strategic version for us to implement. And so the topic wording sets out kind of some a priori restrictions on what we're able to read, right? In a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory. Our first question, which I kind of alluded to in the previous slide, is what exactly does it mean to be a democracy? And so what I have here, right, is that there's very kind of restrictive interpretations that will probably be read by people who think that philosophical debate is more better, right? Abstractly, what is a democracy? Should voting be compulsory? In kind of the pure understanding of a democracy. But realistically, right, in kind of policy versus policy debates, democracy is basically countries that are voting. The obvious question we have left, though, right, is what counts as a democracy? Does it have to be a liberal democracy? Do illiberal democracies count? Can we turn a democracy into voting by making it vote, right? And so this creates all new types of interesting affirmatives like Russia and China. And the topicality question that you'll have to answer is what is a clear bright line? The second question is compulsory, right? Compulsory begs the question of what exactly are the portions of voting that we want to make mandatory, right? Is it necessarily compulsory voting if we have you only vote for the president or the prime minister or the head of state, right? Do we have to compel you to vote for every single thing on the ballot? How many policies should you vote for, etc.? And kind of contouring affirmatives to have compulsory voting for specific offices or specific positions, etc., are all things that smart affirmatives can do, but smart negatives, cutting topicality questions to look out for. So I think T democracy and T compulsory will probably kind of be the core limiting factors in terms of the topicality debate for the alternative, right? The final argument is just this weird semantic thing where LD always has ought, and so some people might use T ought as a reason why you don't get fiat or you don't get plans. Again, I don't think this will be particularly common, in in the type of LD debate that this presentation is specifically kind of geared towards answering, it's just something that I've seen in the past, and I think you should be aware of. A couple of characteristics of good AFs, right? And so there are obviously a lot of affirmatives on this topic. If we let Russia be an AF and Saudi Arabia as an AF, then, pretty soon you start having dozens and dozens of affirmatives. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is what counts as a good affirmative, right? At the end of this conversation, even if you don't exactly know what every single AF does, which, is impossible for me to do even if I was spreading this presentation, I want you to kind of know what to look for when you're cutting a good policy affirmative. And so the first one is good affirmatives generally, right? Not just for this topic, need to have specific mechanism defense. What this means is that very likely if you're cutting an affirmative like a whole res affirmative, you are super susceptible to picks. And the best way to intrinsically garner offense against picks is have a reason why the process of your affirmative is good. What specific benefit is generated by having Congress pass mandatory voting as opposed to the states? What specific benefit is passed by having, Xi Jinping devolve all congressional or elective authority to some type of democratically elected council? The process by which you achieve your affirmative, you have to have a defense for, or else you're very susceptible to people just saying, well, let's do it a different way. The second question is you want to design the affirmative to predict the QNR, right? The biggest advantage that you have to being affirmative is you get to speak first and last. But obviously you give up a couple of, quite important things too by doing this. For example, you don't get kind of the time advantages of the negative, but what you can do to counteract this is specifically, design your affirmative to be able to, so that you already know what the negative will be. What this means is that you should cut small affirmatives. You should cut affirmatives where there's only one viable strategy and just spend a lot of your time kind of, cutting that strategy and things like that. The last thing is you want to have strong intrinsic advantages, right? You don't want to be reading just the, generic hegemony advantage where you cut one card as an internal link that says the word hegemony and then read 12 cards on why hedge is good. Because any smart 2N will read, a topic to add to your weak link and then just also read an advantage counterplan. And that's a very tough place to be in because you don't have any defense of your affirmative. With that being said, right, I think we can now talk about specific affirmatives. And the first one is a whole res AF. I kind of, the whole res AF kind of on face fails basically every single thing that we were talking about earlier. But, right, it does have some advantages, namely that it's very topical and it has a wide range of, advantages, pardon the pun. And so, it's also the most common affirmative, especially among debate programs that are, less policy-esque. And so it's a good idea to be able to discuss it a little bit. For the reasons I talked about earlier, it's not particularly strategic. And while I think a lot of other people will read it, you should consider personally if it's something that you read, right? It's obviously topical, but what you give up by not having to debate topicality, which you might still have to do if you're reading a plan because of is infinite picks. And so at the outstart, I think the generic whole res affirmative is not good. If you have specific topic areas that you think you can garner advantages for, I think it would just be better to read those topic advantages. On that note, the next affirmative I want to talk specifically about is a USFGF. The reason why is because, we obviously live in the United States. I think there's a lot of the kind of media that we consume and the news that we read is centered around the United States, and we have a kind of good understanding of how the democracy, or lack of, based on your interpretation, works just by the fact that we live here and are subject to its elections. There are a couple of ways to do this. The first is that we can make it be done by a congressional amendment, a constitutional amendment. And so there are some reasons to believe that, currently there is no congressional authority to be able to mandate elections. And so you might require some type of constitutional amendment to be able to do that. The second argument is you could do it by some type of incentivization. And so historically, the way that Congress has been able to get around the restrictions that the Constitution puts on it for state governments is by creating incentives or tying incentives. And so, for example, right, in order to have Congress doesn't have explicit authority to mandate what the minimum drinking age is, but what they can do is that they can tie drinking age regulation, which is set by the states, to things like highway funding. And so if a state decides that it wants to sell beer to 20-year-olds, then Congress just swoops in, and then there's no infrastructure stimulus for that state, which tries strong financial incentives for uniformity. And so that's kind of, I think, those are kind of the two normal means mechanisms that are most likely to occur through an affirmative that happens in this way. The problem, of course, right, is that there are other things like gerrymandering that might thump it. But kind of the obvious advantage is that you resolve voter suppression. As kind of, in effect, once you have more voters, you want to be able to resolve the effect of gerrymandering anyway, because strategically partitioning districts based on the distribution of likely voters becomes less probable when everyone has to vote, and it's harder to keep track of things like party affiliation, especially among people who don't really care and don't explicitly register a party affiliation. And so, that's kind of an obvious advantage here. I think the second advantage to the USF-GF is this democratic legitimacy argument, which is kind of, there's this card published in 2017 where this guy was like, the U.S. promoting democracy is literally the best thing that could possibly exist. There are like 50 reasons why this is the only thing that can stop global extinction. But the U.S. doesn't have the authority or soft power to be able to do democracy right now because it just has like no democracy at home. And so the intrinsic advantage here is by doing, universal or compulsory voting, it sends a strong signal about kind of democratic norms that begins reversing trends given by the Trump administration, right? Which is then able to engender a new wave of democratic legitimacy by both allies and enemies that gives the U.S. necessary foreign policy or political or kind of, democratic capital to be able to kind of continue to do the things that Kasparov says are so necessary to prevent extinction. There are also a lot of other squirrely advantages that you could do, or you say the USFG should only mandate voting for a specific, Senate race, or for a specific House congressional district, or just for Congress in general, but not for the president, and things like that. And playing around with those combinations to get unique intrinsic advantages is a very tricky thing you can do, but which is still topical. The States Act is the next act, right? The topic does not mandate an actor, it does not mandate the United States, which means that the States Act is very topical. There are a lot of ideas here. I think it's probably better just given, the contours of the way that debaters are used to thinking about disads and kind of the lack of return of cutting like a state politics disad, but also just the greater flexibility that you have here in the way that the kind of constitutional power ends up playing out. The obvious kind of advantage here is that it avoids the politics disad, right? And so there's a lot of good evidence that when the states do something, it flies under the political radar, even if they do it together, because people are able to make strategic kind of disconnects between what their governor is doing and what the president is doing. I think that's accentuated lately in the political consciousness, right? Because of the way that the coronavirus response was so decentralized, and the focus was, quite literally on the state response. But, right, I think that that gets you out of, the most potent disad, I think, on this topic, which is the 2020 disad. Second, it has an intrinsic legal mechanism, which is really just that, the USFG counterclaim doesn't make too much sense because it's not legal. At least not completely legal unless you do it through some type of weird amendment way. But then, amendments also require the states, and you get intrinsic permutation arguments, and it's kind of, that's the spot you want to be in, where like any mechanism or mechanistic counterclaim has odd fiat theory legitimacy issues. Not because you should particularly read theory, but because the less illegitimate the counterclaim appears to be, the less illegitimate your permutations have to be, which puts you in a good spot strategically. This gets all of the same advantages in the affirmative, right? But it also avoids things like a federalism disad, like a politics disad, which means that, etc. And you could even make kind of a follow-on argument, right? Obviously, that preserves things like politics and federalism, but you can make a follow-on argument to kind of access on the advantages that you think the federal government solves what the states doesn't. But I think this kind of implication only goes one way, which is why I think if you're thinking about the United States, you should strongly consider the States Act. Here's, I guess, maybe an even stronger case for it, which is that you could, the question of what a democracy is a very specific question, right? And it's to the point where if you could probably justify a single state, those states are probably more democratic or more representative, or at best equally representative as the United States federal government. And there's no reason why democracies specifically have to be nation states or countries. And so it's very likely you could have, say, specifically mandatory voting only in California, or only in Texas, or something like that. And you can have advantages to senators, to specific things like Medicaid expansion, etc., and use those states to be able to get other things. I think the last thing I wanted to say here was about follow-on, which I already mentioned on the previous slide. But basically, right, you have 50 combinations of states here that you could go for, which is a very, very large number and particularly good for you. The next question is something I've already alluded to because I'm very excited about it. Partially because I think questionably T Affs are just the core, or should be the core of every topic, which are, the aptly named questionably T affirmatives. The question you want to ask yourself is what it means to be a democracy, right? And you shouldn't be able to have a good answer for this in a way that gives you any actual affirmative ground. There are a couple of classes here. The first are kind of the illiberal democracies, countries that still have voting, where the leaders nominally respect kind of, the result of the vote. But kind of rig the election or do some type of poll interference to ensure that the result always goes the way that they want it to be. And these are the states like Turkey, Hungary, Russia, etc., right? And I think there's a very strong case to make that these countries are actually countries with democracy, but just weak democratic norms which could be enforced. Particularly through the plan. And you should make the strong argument that the most intrinsic advantage to compulsory voting is democratic resurgence. And so, but that advantage can only be made in these types of illiberal pseudo-democracies, which I think is a good reason for why, these interpretations of affirmatives are topical and good for topic education writ large. There are obviously other advantages, right? Engendering mandatory democracy or mandatory voting in Russia, right? Probably has some type of normal means interpretation that says that Putin can't rig the vote, which, as a consequence, implies that Putin could lose power, it could destabilize Russia, help U.S. hegemony, a bunch of things like that, right? Resurgence of democratic norms in countries like Russia also might just encourage more heterodox foreign policy, which could increase the strength of NATO, decrease Russian expansionism, etc. And so there's just a lot of good things that can happen, or potentially good things based on the impact out of here. The second type of questionably topical affirmatives are a little bit more questionable. I think these are the ones where you have to invest a significant amount of time and topicality to get away with. The problem is there are also a lot of disas associated with many of these affirmatives, so I think of them more as maybe out-round asks than any type of sustained affirmative reading. And so these are, your countries where there isn't really a sustained democracy right now, and compulsory voting doesn't mean anything unless you specify it in the plan text. I think there's a kind of topicality argument to be made here that says that these countries are topical because, they're not real democracies, but neither are the other ones. There's no bright line to determine what a real democracy is, and there's good topic education to be thought of in terms of thinking, what if we made compulsory voting mandatory in these countries, because that would probably turn them into democracies. The next class of questionably topical affirmatives are not about states, right? They're about other types of things that might not completely be topical. The first one is specific policies, right? I'm not going to mandate voting everywhere. I'm only going to mandate voting for, a couple of subsections of... I'm only going to mandate voting for a couple of specific policies, a couple of specific elections, etc. Right? You could get very specific intrinsic results that say, like, on this specific policy, I want everyone to vote to defeat this bill. And then, it's almost like this weird agenda politics dissent, but on the affirmative, where you can get just, like, bill good, bad impacts. I, again, think that those probably aren't the most strategic in the long run, just because of how squirrely and questionably topical they are, and I think they make very, very good for out-round asks. Larger IGOs also make for interesting affirmative topics, right? We'll talk, I think, shortly about a EU Act, which is technically, a democracy kind of, because it's this IGO where people vote and send representatives to a panel that make decisions, but, we're unsure. There are other very squirrely acts where you can make it mandatory for kind of a specific region and have weird geopolitical advantages. And so the example here is Nigeria, where politics are largely sutured along kind of a northern line, which I believe is more Islamic, and the southern region, which is more Christian. Though I might have the regions mixed up. It's been a while since I've studied Nigerian politics. But there's this kind of disconnect between a very Christian population and a very Islamic population. And that kind of creates odd geopolitical tensions that you could say decisively resolve in one way by mandating voting in one area, but not the other area, or something like that. Again, these very squirrely apps, kind of the point of this is not necessarily to say that the Nigeria is mandatory voting only for, the northern region is a good affirmative, but just to kind of give you examples that apps here can get very, very squirrely. And as kind of good 2As, your job is to get very squirrely with apps and outright apps and new apps and very creative so you can get out of as much round as possible. The next type of affirmative, I think, is the EU affirmative. And so we kind of talked about this earlier, but it's where people in European countries don't necessarily have to vote in their local elections, but they have to vote in the European Union elections. I think the main advantage of this is that it can strengthen the legitimacy of the EU, right? Recently, there have been kind of major hits to the EU with things like Brexit, the Greek debt crisis, etc., but forcing every person who lives in an EU country to vote for EU representatives, I think increases the robustness of the kind of election because people like to feel informed when they vote, and so they might be able to, read about the election, and it also makes them feel like they have a greater voice in this IGO, which might be able to do things like kind of, lower nationalism, increase the legitimacy of the union, etc. Right? The kind of advantage ground here is that it stops Russia. A stronger EU naturally serves as a regional hegemonic counterweight to kind of Russia, which has a lot of the same advantages as the kind of Russia, a liberal democracy argument here. And I think it can also stop kind of a resurgence of right-wing secessionist EU arguments by increasing legitimacy through a mechanism that we talked about earlier. The next type of affirmative that I want to talk about are the subset affirmatives. And so these are the affirmatives that don't necessarily mandate everyone do it, but you only do it for a subset of policies. And so it's very similar to kind of, the subset, to the specific affirmatives that we talked about earlier, and it helps guard you against things like picks, right? And so you could say, I want everyone to vote except for the states of Florida, Georgia, and Arizona. And why might you want these states? Because, this avoids the link to the politics that says that only in those 3 states does mandatory voting increase the probability that Trump wins in those states. And so you can guard against those picks. The question, obviously, is that these are less topical because, you've decreased the amount of the affirmative, and it also is not, necessarily the best. The next argument, though, is that it creates weird downstream effects with the mandating. For example, right, it could eliminate things like the cost to voting, but these are, I think, a lot weirder and a lot squirrelier. They're not necessarily things I recommend. It's just kind of this subset argument is something I want to throw out there so that you're comfortable with it if anyone debates you on it. Next, right, where we can talk about negative grounds, which I think is at risk of sounding biased, the more interesting of the 2 grounds, of the 2 sides. The topic is vague. Right? We just spent literally 20 minutes talking about different affirmatives. There are a lot of countries. What this necessarily means is that it hurts the quality of negative research. I know 2As don't like to hear this, but when there are more affirmatives, you can't, spend all your time researching a specific decide on a specific affirmative because the time trade-off just, it doesn't make any sense. And so what that means, right, is that we want to focus on a couple of things. So first is generic ground. Generics are always your friend, but they're also very specifically your friend against giant topics. And so, the trade-off is it's obviously harder to come up with generics because you have to think of things that are very, very broad. But what we'll do here, right, obviously, is we'll assume that some action has occurred. And so the first generic is the coronavirus decide. It's very likely, especially with the continued attack on the kind of the mail system in the U.S. and other countries, just that mandatory voting requires a lot of people to go to the polls. And even if it doesn't require it, it does cause people to go to the polls who otherwise would not have left their house and interact with a lot of other people. What this can do is that it can cause kind of, a lot of... what this can do is that it can cause a lot of enforcement problems, right? Specifically, right, obviously it can spread coronavirus, and the second argument is that mandatory voting has to be done in person, because otherwise there's no kind of, enforcement mechanism to ensure that people vote. There's a very strong, oh no, it just got lost in the mail question, or things like that, which means that any type of enforced mandatory voting would have to be done in person, which engenders kind of all of the coronavirus lost impacts. This obviously has a laundry list of reasons why it's bad. Coronavirus kills a lot of people. It's a fundamentally inhumane thing. It encourages a rise of authoritarianism. It hurts the economy. It could collapse U.S. hegemony in a U.S.-specific affirmative. It could destabilize the CCP even further, right? Kind of, if you look at kind of the way that Xi has backlashed recently because of the loss of legitimacy that occurred in kind of Hong Kong, a second wave, things like that. etc. So that's kind of, the first core generic. The second core generic is what I'll kind of refer to as a randomization decide, but I think a better name for it might be kind of some type of informational suppression decide. This is where people who don't care vote, and so it creates kind of an informational distortion in the amount of people who are voting. What this means is it sends distortionary signals. The idea here is a fundamentally economic one. What it says is that when people care enough to vote, those are the ones who vote, and that actually sends an accurate signal about what policies people care about, more or less, because the people who care will vote for candidates with that mandate. But if you have random people voting, they might just fill out a random ballot, which means that it's hard to grasp a mandate of what it means to be really democratic. Not only does this decrease legitimacy because people will be like, oh, that person didn't actually win, a bunch of people just cast random ballots for him because he had a funny name or whatever, but it also increases the incentive for propaganda, because leaders who know people have to vote might target low information voters who don't care enough to fact check signals, and then use that fact check to be able to get a bunch of low information voters who would have stayed home to vote for them via the use of propaganda. That can cause things like an increase in the rise of fascism, right? As fascists like Cambridge Analytica did in 2016 kind of use informational distortions to be able to increase the legitimacy of minority rule. The next argument, I think the next counterplan is a mail-in counterplan. This resolves a coronavirus decide. And what basically this says, it also resolves a randomization decide. And the general idea behind the counterplan is just that everyone is mailed a ballot, but we don't mandate that you send it back. What this means is that people who don't care, e.g. randomized people, don't send the ballot back in, but it also resolves all of the kind of barriers to entry democracy arguments that were previously made. It also resolves the coronavirus decide, because you can't really get coronavirus from sending a letter in the mail. And so it resolves both of these, but, it also is competitive because it's not mandatory, because we don't require that you send a ballot back, right? Requiring sending ballots back almost always means mandatory vote by mail is not competitive, because it's almost impossible to enforce that every ballot kind of comes back. It also funds the mail system, which is not an intrinsic advantage that you should read in your debate. I think it's just a nice, we don't care to Trump, which is always good. The next argument is T-democracy. This will obviously be your friend, just because of the amount of affirmatives that there are. The question you want to ask yourself is what, a democracy is here. Yeah, and so the idea here is that it serves as, I'm at risk of sounding crass, almost like a rich uncle topicality. What these they are arguments of last resort. Which means that, you should always have T-democracy in the arsenal, just so that you're theoretically prepared to go for it in a world where, you have nothing out to go for. And the reason why it's called rich uncle topicality is because, like a rich uncle, it always is there for you if you need it, but otherwise you shouldn't really interact with it at all. I don't know how salient this joke is anymore. I heard it at camp a few years ago. I thought it was a nice name to kind of generally remember the parameters. The kind of key is you want to wield, T-democracy in a way that limits the topic, and allows you to focus very specifically on negative prep. Once you have T-democracy and you have a good interpretation of T-democracy, a lot of the kind of odder affirmatives that we talked about earlier are no longer viable, and because of that lack of viability, it allows you to focus prep in the places that you want. The last piece of kind of generic negative evidence that I want to talk about are picks. And so, and so what picks are, right, is they are good ways for you to be able to also limit affirmatives, right? They get rid of broad affirmative, and it also gives you kind of the ability to just read one disad and answer a lot of specific affirmatives. If I, for example, just say that Arizona is bad, I get out of any affirmative that includes the U.S. If I just say, the EU is bad, I can pair it with like a Russia good disad, a politics disad, etc. And pairing those picks means that not only does it kind of, and this is not the reason why you want to read picks, but it kind of lowers the quality of research on your disads that you need to do, which makes it easier to combat large topics like this one, but it also is just better topic prep and a very powerful weapon, because it means that smaller net benefits become much more salient. It also means that every affirmative that is not whole res becomes a counterplan, because I can just read my X country affirmative paired with any Y country bad as a pick. It's the easiest argument against squirrely affs as well, right? Because when affs are squirrely, you probably don't have a lot of decided ground, and so any marginal risk of a counterplan of a decided is now an extra salient reason to vote